Hi everyone, welcome to CDR. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the format by now because you've been playing your music. But CDR is a forum and a place to gather for producers to hear their productions on a great sound system, network, meet each other, create some kind of a community. And as well as that, we invite a special artist to come and talk about their particular process and how they do what they do as well. So today we have a very unique artist, I'd say. Her name's Nkisi. I'm going to read off a piece of paper, which I don't normally do, but I mean this in the best possible way. I actually find it quite hard to describe your music. It's so sort of like trance-like and rhythmic, and it's not really like much music else that I hear, certainly from contemporary producers. So I'm going to read this. Nkisi produces intense, powerful club tracks, equally influenced by African polyrhythms, hardcore techno, and 70s Italian horror films. The London-based musician and visual artist is one of the co-founders of Non Worldwide, a collective of experimental artists from across the African diaspora. She's released on Lee Gamble's Week label, and during the pandemic has set up her own record label, Initiation. Initiation's aim is to explore the hidden phantasmagorical properties of rhythm, a secret drum language only understood by the initiated. A microcosmic encapsulation of mellow rhythmic trance. CDR, please give it up for Nkisi.
Hello.
I'm sorry I bumbled my way through all those really long words. I do kind of find it quite hard to describe your music. How would you describe it yourself? Or maybe we should just go into some of the songs to let the music talk. But how would you describe your music?
Yeah, I think I would describe it as like trance, rhythmic. Maybe I can also not describe my music, I think.
It's hard, right? I personally find it hard. We're gonna let the music do talking. This track is called Le Parole. when we spoke earlier, you and we kind of talked about the sort of concept and format of CDR. The first thing you said to me was you consider yourself not a producer but an artist. Now, firstly, I disagree with that because I would say you were both. But I kind of want to know. We were just talking upstairs about how I started, making production during lockdown. Is because it's such an exploration of rhythm. For me, I hate to just like make myself sound like a bit of a simpleton, but for me, it's like I want to sound like this producer, and I watch a YouTube tutorial on how to do it. I'm kind of curious to know how your formative steps into music production was it straight away into just kind of like these trance like rhythms, or did you used to be a garage producer, or like what was those kind of early steps into production, and what did that look like or sound like, feel like?
I think my early steps were, I don't know, I think I started making music when I was in a pretty dark space in my life. So then, when I was kind of vibing in my darkness, I was really into like Doomcore, because I felt like it had this like different elements that I really enjoyed, where it was like this like hard beats and then this kind of like more emotional like melodies. And then I think very quickly I also could connect, because I guess when I was younger I used to listen to that in my house, to like more like African music or like Congolese like rumba and dombolo. But then when I would like go out with my friends, like mostly like gabber and like harder like electronic music like jungle, drum and bass. So then when I was like listening to all this like doomcore tracks, or when I was like trying to figure out how I was even gonna start with it, I kind of figured out that there was really like a big similarity of like this like intensity, but then also this like emotional core that I could like really connect to. So then I don't know, I think, and that's like pretty interesting, because I feel like I always still go to this decision I made at some point where I was just like, oh, I'm just gonna focus on rhythm and like focus on like this idea of like this emotional melodies that can trigger some kind of form of like emotional release.
So even back then, it was very much focused on drums and rhythm.
Yeah. I was really like interested. Obviously, in the beginning, I was using much more samples, so it was like more about like how I would layer certain things. I was also really interested in how to, just layer different rhythms on top of each other, but also how I could maybe start with something that could be like a normal like 4/4 beat or like a recognizable beat, but then like how I could add something else on top of it that would kind of like break the rhythm. So I think in a weird way I was always interested in this like idea of like break beat, but then something that was very repetitive.
I'm not that familiar with Doomcore. So what kind of artists would you say there was kind of like artists that inspired you to just kind of, because almost going back to what I was talking about, like sometimes a lot of producers start out with imitation before they kind of find their own sound.
Yeah.
Is that something that you did, or?
I think maybe it was just more like, not really like imitating a genre, but I think because I needed it so much at that time, this like release of like emotional, but also I was really in this like fuck the world kind of vibe. So I think like I was just like, Doomcore, because I felt like that had this like element. But then there was this like one producer that I was following his label, like Doomcore Records, like Low Entropy. They're like based in Hamburg. And it was really interesting because I was really, at some point I was getting so obsessed with their music, and then I was also like posting my music on SoundCloud. I had this like weird kind of like methodology, because I was making music on the internet, on this like internet app called, how is it called again? Oh, I forgot. Okay, I will remember. It was like an internet app, and then my methodology was that like I would make the track, because I was thinking about this like direct release of energy. So I would make the track and directly put it on SoundCloud. I would not think about it twice. I would just be like, okay, I finish it, I put it on SoundCloud. Then I used to, just do this thing of just like tagging it like Doomcore. And I don't, and I think because the Doomcore.
The old classic SoundCloud days. Yeah.
So I think because the Doomcore, maybe like the Doomcore circle was tiny. So I think Low Entropy then heard my tracks and then like reached out to me. I was like, oh, do you want to release on Doomcore Records? So it was like this like full circle. In like, and so I think the first tracks that I released on his label were maybe like the first tracks that I made. Because I guess like I had like connection with music, but it was more, you know, this typical thing of like singing in a funk band or singing in a band. But I never really had this thing of like producing. So that was like really interesting to kind of like get to this point where I would be like, oh, I'm making beats. And the good thing also with this like internet app was that, so it wasn't, so it was like this weird software where you had to drag drum machines, and so you had like an 808, so you really, so it was really like, and like you had to drag like effects pedals, so it was really visual. So that's also what made it so easy for me to actually transition from that to like having gear, because it was literally that I would like deal with on the app.
And because when you said you were a producer, you're like, oh, Logic, Ableton, I just use them to record, really.
Yes.
And have you always just been drawn towards gear and being like quite hands-on with kind of analog gear or
Yeah, I think it was just because of that internet app, having this like machines that I had to drag on the, and then I remember when I was gonna, because we actually had like a band for a minute, but I remember when I started getting into the studio with like John T. Guest, with Santi, then he was like, oh, what do you want to work with? I can get you like, you know, drum machines. I remember he got his drum machines without lights. And I was like used to like seeing like on like the internet app, like seeing, like the 808 with like the lights of the beats like passing. So I was like, I cannot make drums on here. And then he went to get like, I think it was like an 808 or whatever. And then that's how, for the first time, I kind of got into touching machines. And then, but then it felt like I understood, because you also had to like connect the cables. So I think it's just what I'm doing now. It's kind of weirdly just like the material version of what I was doing on the internet. It's so bizarre.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of watched that fact video where you've got some crazy gear that like I haven't even seen before, like a thing that you're blowing into and stuff. Like, what does your studio setup look like now? Is it?
I think like mostly like drum machines, and that's like what's also really interesting with kind of evolving, I guess, from being like online to being like IRL, is that like, you know, the studio kind of like becomes bigger and bigger depending on, you know, new things that I get. So I kind of like, I think this was my first drum machine I got, like the Digitect.
Yeah, okay, I was just going to say, tell the audience what it is.
So it's like the first one I got, and then, you know, and then it was more kind of like listening to, obviously, like, because when you like learn yourself, you deal so much with like tutorials. So a lot of times I would be like, oh, I like the sound of this like drum machine, then get it. So I guess like now I'm kind of like, I have like a bunch of drum machines. I also love to work with like effects pedal. And then this it's been like the best thing ever is to meet like Soma, that like label that does like the Soma pipe, and then also has this like amazing drum machine like the Pulsar 23, and also like some really great like synths and stuff. So I'm kind of obsessed. I already got everything almost they have.
And did you know, in kind of exploring all this gear, have you had a mentor? Is it just reading the manual, or is it just messing about and seeing what happens?
Yeah, I think because I don't know if it comes because I actually come from like the visual arts, and I was doing like photography and like video and stuff. So I kind of always had this thing, and maybe I was also always like interested in that and like how to deal with stuff as like an amateur, because sometimes I feel like when you get too much in the skill, sometimes you can also like lose this like being able to have this like accidental thing that comes out of it. So I think, I know I've had like people like see me use my drum machines and just be like, oh, that's not really the way you should use it, but it's great, you know? And I'm actually like really happy about that, because I think that's like, you know, even with CDJs, when I DJ, I always try to, I don't know. I think music making has become so spiritual for me that's more just like when I have a connection with the gear, and then like whatever happens, happens. But then there's also something beautiful with like, when you get into this like improvisational mind, and when you start getting into this like focus, maybe you fuck up a few times, but then it kind of works, and then you learn out of your mistakes. And then also I think, because that's also how I started DJing, and I would like get my drum machine and maybe like have to play a live show like 2 days later, and then it's like, but then, just because you kind of like are on the stage and you kind of just have to, just like wing it.
Sometimes that time pressure brings out some really intense creativity.
Literally.
Let's get into one more track, but I kind of want to quickly go into the meaning of the name Nkisi.
Yes.
Can you please explain to
So Nkisi, I guess, has like different layers. Like in like the language of like my heritage, it means like medicine, but then also like sacred medicine. And then Nkisi can also be seen as like a form of like a shaman, like a healer. And then it also is the name of like these beautiful statues that you find everywhere in British Museum. That were statues from like ancient Congo traditions, these beautiful statues with all the nails. They should bring them back.
It's something quite ingrained into your music as well. But should we listen to one more track?
Yes.
Should we do Triple X?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, loosely, you could call it techno, and you said that like 90s techno was an influence, but I think a common thread within your music is very much sort of the transcendental nature and the sort of ritualistic or tribal thing. Can you tell me more about the sort of like research you've been doing into that kind of world and incorporating that into sort of like techno music or electronic music as a sort of a broad stroke?
Yeah, I think it all probably started with my obsession with rhythm and just like being, on the dance floor, dancing, feeling what rhythm has done to me, but then also going into this research of researching like ancient traditions in like different cultures, specifically going into like the Congo traditions, how important this like rhythm is. I got these few CDs from like a friend of my mom that was like working for this label of like world music, and I remember just listening to all these rhythms, and I was like, wow, like a lot of these rhythms I really could like recognize in like contemporary music. Then diving much more deeper in that, and obviously there is
But
this like
the CD was like old traditional rhythms.
yeah, like all traditional rhythms, like from Congo, from Rwanda, like very specifically from like different like groups of people, and then then I just realized like wow, like there's a lot of like these rhythmic patterns that I can really recognize from like listening to music, dancing on music, and then one day I dove into like I came up or like I found this like research that I don't remember who this person's name is anymore, but they were talking about this like seven rhythms, like seven like rhythms from the continent
Like
that
an
could
album.
yeah. So that came later, but like the seven rhythms on the continent that like basically influenced a lot of like contemporary music and like really like showing it like very in detail. And then part of like my research was also obviously like a lot of my research and conceptually is also connected to like how to kind of decondition the mind, because I think I was thinking a lot about like how we've used language, maybe there was also kind of like my own personal disappointment because I wanted to do documentary photography. I even wanted to be like a war photographer. So I think at some point I was like really disappointed by the image, because I came to this point of like, yeah, we're so, so like hypnotized by images. It's so difficult to like bring other images in our like realm. So I was like, okay, let's build images with music. And then, so then.
Sorry, you were disappointed. Like I'm unsure because you I've one. It's amazing that you wanted to be a documentary, but you were disappointed with the lack of imagery in music.
No.
So,
I was disappointed with that it was impossible to actually have like maybe like a political message in like with images. So then I thought, maybe in this like radical political position, I thought the only way to kind of like dehypnotize this world of like this like domination of like the image, that it would only be able to happen with music, because I understood also very quickly that like music has so much like visuality in it, and that maybe it's like the only way how we can kind of like think about a new world. And obviously like with all this beautiful music that kind of has always been connected to like revolution or like emancipation of people.
And it's a joining force as well for people.
Yeah,
like it's
exactly.
the sort of sense of bringing people together.
Exactly.
It's almost like the oldest form, and maybe sex as well. Like
yeah, exactly, exactly. And then it's also like coming onto this researching, and then I come onto this like stories of like bois caïman, that's like like there was like a very important like ritual and like musical revolution in like the 1700s when like Haiti got independence. And then I was like, oh wow, so it's like the drum has like so much power. Then also thinking about like how you had like Code Noir, where it was like the drum was the slaves couldn't use the drum, the drums were banned. So then you start realizing like, oh, but like music has so much power, and like so much power is in the rhythm. So then,
is this research? Is it just collecting music, CDs, YouTube wormholes, or have you actually gone to rituals and kind of explored,
yeah,
in different societies?
yeah. So in January I went to like the Voodoo Festival, and that was like the first time I actually took a plane and went to the continent exactly to like experience some of that. And it was so beautiful because it was really like realizing that this like ritual of bringing people together, but then also the connection with like music and memory, and how important that side of it is also. um, so yeah, then coming back to like the dance floor, and like whatever is like possible of like bringing people together, and how a lot of like community also gets formed like on the dance floor. Then you start really seeing like the potential of rhythm. But then then some of my research was also in like psychoacoustics, and then like one of these like amazing ideas of psychoacoustics are also that our brain actually can predict rhythm. So like like if you keep hearing like the same repetition of rhythm, after a while your brain will always try to predict it in advance. So then I started thinking like, oh wow, like actually that's also like a strategy, rhythmic strategy that you can like play with in tracks, where you can get people used to a certain rhythm, and then from the moment that this brain wants to like predict it, and actually break it and like bring something else in or go somewhere else. Yeah. So yeah, to always get into this idea of like the trance, and also I don't know, I'm just so interested, maybe that's like more the spiritual side of it, of like how can we push consciousness to another height, but also how, yeah, like I think what for me it's also like the best compliment when I do a gig or something, when someone's like, oh, I really connected with the music, but also like it made me think about certain things, or it got me to it got me over some sadness, or even sometimes like it got me to be just like, yeah, I can deal with the hardship in my life. And I think sometimes that's really important, even just to, yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to be quoted on this because I definitely don't know the source and I'm not a scholar, but I remember someone or reading something about sort of like the way the brain sort of works with music. There's like a satisfaction of kind of knowing, and there's also like another different sort of chemicals released when something surprises you. And something you do a lot with your music is cross rhythms and polyrhythms, which I guess it makes the brain harder to work out. So it's kind of reaches this sort of like getting lost a little bit, as opposed to just a straight 4/4 kick, and I know exactly where the drop's going to happen, and that's what's going to happen. There's that. There's a 909 hi-hat, just right on time, like I expected it to. I mean, have you seen or even experienced yourself sort of these kind of like trance-like states with the music, either or yourself or some of the music you've experienced or kind of immersed yourself in?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's this like double thing of just myself, like while I'm playing the music, or while I'm like programming, or there's always like a live element, even if I record it, to kind of get myself in that trance. So that's kind of like one of my goals. That's why like a lot of my live shows are like improvised. And then at the other side, it's like, I remember one specifically where I was like, I think I was definitely like on the verge of being like in trance, because I didn't expect it. I think I was like in New York, and it must have been this like, I think like Dominican Independence or something. And I'm just like walking down the streets to like go back to where I was staying, and I'm just hearing these drums, and I'm like just like some other side in my brain just gets like triggers. And I actually managed to, because I think I was a few streets further, and actually managed to like localize the drummers. It was just this really interesting, yeah, like trance, but also like this call and this like kind of like magnetic pull that I that I like experienced then, that I always like think back of because it was like so beautiful, and then just like arriving there and like hearing this like great music. So I think it's also something, or like I always like to say that, you know, like when you're in the womb, like, you know, like we deal with rhythm first, you know, the heartbeat. So I think like we are really, really, really like connected to rhythm even more than we think. And even if you think about it, even tone is rhythm too, you know. So even if you really, really have to go, you know, like scientific and like physical with it, like even the melody could also, you know, be rhythm. So just the musical experience is connected to rhythm. I also like to think that like our planet is like a library of music because there's so many sounds. But then the polyrhythm is also with like, you know, if you really just like start listening around you, it's just like, okay, you have the rhythm of the cars, and then you have the rhythm of your washing machine, or the tube, or like the train on top of your breathing. So it's like you actually realize that like everything is different layers like connected to each other, and it's like this push and pull of all the rhythms together that actually like gets, you know, like makes the whole. Sorry. So so then it also becomes like, yeah, like interesting to look at music as like a cosmic like event, and like how that's also, you know, even when we before we see planets, we hear them, you know, you can hear like Saturn, you can hear like all the stars and stuff, the pulsar stars. So yeah, I think, and that's like what was really important even in like my research to come to where I am now, is when I dove into this like Congo cosmology. It was like one of the most amazing things that was said was like, we hear before we see. And then I was like, wow, that's so deep, because we always think that we see the world, we see, you know, we always identify ourselves with where we are with like our eyes, and never with like our ears. And actually realizing that even, you know, color is vibration, so everything is vibration, so it's always connected to like a sonic principle. But then it also gives a form of like responsibility that I feel that you get, or like that I feel that I have now, since I'm really conscious with that also, and with like how, you know, I'm dealing with like sound waves and vibration, that it's really just like, you know, you're really working with energy and like creating energy, and no energy goes, you know, you can only create energy, energy doesn't disappear. So then it's also just like whatever energy that can be added to a room, or you know, can also be like,
I mean, from someone I've just become a father, like the babies can't see it first, and even for the first few months, they only really see in black and white. And the first thing you do with a newborn baby is actually put them on your chest so that they hear your heartbeat. It's called just like skin to skin to create that connection. So it's interestingly saying you actually kind of telling me about at the Voodoo Festival, sort of with the drumming group, some of the relationship between the younger generation and elder generation. Can you expand a little bit on that
that was beautiful, because obviously like a lot of the rituals, or you know, these moments, these events, these gatherings, sometimes you felt like you just were kind of like waiting around. There was never like a beginning of you know, the beginning of a thing and then like the end, but it was always just be this like really interesting way how like the kids would like start like doo, 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 and just like arrive like this, and then like arts all start playing together, and then like the older kids would like come with the drums and play a little bit, and then before you know it, it's like suddenly you have like the drum masters playing, and you know, but then you look at your clock and you're like, oh wow, we've been here for like 3 hours. So it's also like, again, this idea of like rhythm and time, and I think I've learned a lot about like how music actually creates space, um, and space as time, and how it can like shrink and like open it up. So yeah, that was really interesting. I think I learned a lot also about like being together, and what actually like music does to even how you deal with an environment. Because I think we're here, we're like so used to having music indoors, or like you get into a club, or you know, you have like different places where you really have this like architecture of club that you stay there like as long as you as possible. But then also like having music outside, it creates this like other way of just like even understanding how like this like sound vibrations kind of travel to other places.
Yeah, the space it's in is important, you know, like because it's the setting. Um, we're going to have a bit of time for questions if anyone has any. But one thing I wanted to kind of get into is just actually sort of how you start a track and work on your rhythms.
Yeah.
So you've kindly brought some drum machines along.
Yes, I brought 2 drum machines.
Does anyone want to hear Nkisi? What are the drum machines?
So I brought the Digitect, obviously. That's like always one
That was your first machine as well?
Yeah, that's the first one. Yeah. And it's also really nice because you can use like the MIDI. So when I use my other synthesizer, I can also like program MIDI. And then this one I got recently is also from Electron, like the model cycles. And this one is really fun. I really like this one because it's very like, it's really, really easy to use, and then you can do it. I think it's a really nice one for live because you can change so much live. I didn't bring any effects pedal, so it's like raw. So
raw is good.
Normally it's a bit more noisy and drivey, but like maybe it's also nice to play like that. I brought like how I do my live sets is that because I actually really for the live sets I really want to focus on the improv side of the drumming. So a lot of like my...
Just quickly, do you find it scary? Like improvising with no
I
structure?
love improvising.
Right.
That's the funny part of it, that like I love improvising so much because it's really about like the connection with like your ear and what you hear, and then how I work. But I'll
But do you have a rough plan and improvise parts, or is it fully just...
So I guess like the only thing that's maybe not improvised, because I cannot really have my melodies. I cannot really, because when I get into the melodies, it's an all other, then I have to really go deep, and then maybe I'm not even there. So like I always have my melodies, like samples, kind of on my CDJ, and then they kind of like play through, and then I kind of just like build a track like on top of that. Yeah. So maybe I can.
Let's get into the drum machines. You're gonna have a melody. Oh, okay, nice.
So to just like have some, and then, because then maybe it's also easier to kind of understand how.
Okay.
I kind of do it. Okay, so.
Are these samples you've loaded in? Or is
so they're all like drum rhythms, and then like so then you see, so it's like that's that one, and then I just played it like this. of
Do you,
work.
do you have a system for what drum samples you have and what is it step sequencer? You know, like, or is it just you? Do you just know what's loaded in or do you have a kind of
I guess maybe sometimes
methodology that?
I think sometimes it's like muscle memory, so I kind of like understand if it's like this pattern, I kind of know, you know, where things are. But then it's really just trying and just like, oh, I like how this sounds, and then just like. And with polyrhythm, it always kind of works when they're synced. It will always kind of work.
And obviously, using a CDJ in your live set is not linked to a MIDI clock or anything. It's just kind of yeah.
I just need to like.
Just see what happens. So she's just set a loop on the CDJ. So she said that's when she mainly gets into a trance with the. Yeah.
Because then it's easier, then you can really just like go from one place to another place.
So this is kind of what you do for. I mean, from someone who hasn't done that, it looks a lot more fun than drawing in MIDI in the Ableton drum rack. So, you kind of said this is what similar without the pedals and a lot of I've seen some of the crazy gear that you've DeFi Live stuff. But is this a similar process to the music that you record to put out as well? Is it a similar kind of technique and improvisational recording process?
I think the drums will always be like that, because I think part of I guess when I'm thinking about this like ritual and like the drums, but also to like have this like talking drums and the relationship between all the layers with each other, I feel like I need to play them. So that's also how I get the like kind of more improvised kind of feeling. But then I guess when I'm in the studio or when I'm working on the recording, then it's like maybe like the melodic part, that's like when I'm like working on it, and then it's also like more layered. I guess when I work live, I also have like the CDJ go through like an effects pedal, so then I can also like work on that and like have some effects on that. And then obviously that's like part of the live element, to go into this like trancey moment where I'm just like looping and but then I think when I'm trying to produce, or when I'm being the producer, then I'm working.
I think you should stop saying that you're not a producer, because you clearly are.
Then I think a lot. I love working with panning, so I think a lot is like how I layer things together and how I work with like panning. There's like one panner that I really love. It's called like Energy Panner, that does this like 360 panning, and it's really nice because it really like gives this really like spatial side. And then I guess when I work with vocals, also like how. So then I think a lot about like how the panning, how certain sound can like cross together, and how like it can really. Because I think a lot about sound kind of being in like your crown chakra. So when sometimes you listen to sound, and like certainly when it's like when music is like very like when everything is like in like a really nice place and travels really nicely, I feel always like it's like kind of stimulating my crown chakra. So I like to think about that also, that element of then being able to connect with like higher forces. But I think like, yeah, if I focus on like the drum patterns, and it's really just like working on that, maybe, I guess like, and that's what I'm really realizing now, like part of making music is like, that's why sometimes like the live shows become like really fun, because then I'm also not like stuck in this like listening back.
I imagine, I'm going to take a rough guess, that you have your equipment, you play, and you probably get in quite a trance-like state, and suddenly you've got a 10-hour recording, and you're like, how am I going to edit this into a song? I'm guessing that happens quite a lot.
Yes. So I guess like the way how I kind of do, because I think like a lot of like the rhythmic ideas come from doing live, because it's really interesting, like say like I play a show in like Amsterdam where people are maybe more connected to like a 4/4, because it's about like, when I play live, I like to kind of play with like what works with like the rhythmic bodies of like the audience, and then kind of like start from there and shift it. But then like a few months back, I played in Lisbon, and then there, because they have the like connection with like funk, like Brazilian funky music and like Angolan music. When I re-listened to the recording, it was like I was going in some other places with the rhythm. So I think it's also with like how the people like move to the rhythm. I get like other ideas.
I guess if you are improvising and you're feeding off the energy of the crowd, that's going to totally change what you do next, because you're like,
exactly.
Oh, they're like that. I'm going to kind of like tune into that side a bit more.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And then what's nice about getting the recordings is like come home, and then like certain rhythms I feel, so then I also start realizing what my favorite, like one of my favorite rhythms that I love like dropping on top of it is like, I guess on the program is like 313, is like tak, 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 tak. So it's also really nice, because when you have like all the bum bum bum, like everything happening, but then when you get like the I just feel like people connect to it like differently, and then like when you put some delay.
I'm a little bit curious to like what the editing process is like. Do you like multi-track everything so that you've got all the stems, and then And then how do you go about creating the final product out of a jam session?
So sometimes you can start with like the jam session is actually like sourcing the melodies, because I feel like the melodic part I feel like that's always like really like source, where I have to like, that's when I go into my emotional side. That's where I kind of think about like, oh, like what am I feeling? And then I think then, which is really interesting, then it's kind of maybe like when I have the melody and say if I want to do vocals or not, then maybe that kind of like exists before, and then the rhythm kind of comes after.
Yeah.
So it's sometimes it's difficult.
We've talked so much about drums. Like,
Yeah.
what is your approach to melody? Do you play? You sample? What's the?
Yeah, like now I play much more. I feel like it's like a really interesting place. I think like certainly when, you know, you like kind of like focus a lot on like rhythm. Like I feel like melody, that's like maybe like the really intuitive part, because I don't think my research, like I think the rhythm, that's like very research based, where I'm like listening, or like I understand the kind of probably also a form of like ancestral like elements also of it, which also is interesting with like, ooh, like I recognize these rhythms are like in my body. So that's where I play a lot with. But then I think when I go for the melodies, then it's really just like, yeah, then that's like my emo side. That's where I get like emotional, and that's like where I feel like, you know, that's where I cannot even say, you know, put words on it, because that's like where I'm really like intuitively channeling some emotion.
Well, I guess if a lot of the rhythm comes from rituals, I guess it's kind of like tapping into something ancient, really.
Mm-hmm.
And then the melody is more of your sort of like how you're feeling at that very moment.
Yeah. I guess like the melody, yeah, that's true what you say. I think like maybe the rhythm is like what you say, like this ancient structures. Who knows who I was in my past life? You know, maybe it's like some weird past life connection, and maybe the melody is actually more, you know, when I'm getting a bit more autobiographical, and where it's like my life.
The emo. Yeah.
The heartbreaks and stuff.
Do we have any questions from anyone in the crowd?
You mentioned...
Not right by the speaker. Come on, mate. You should know better.
You mentioned you usually run the CDJ through an effects pedal.
Yes.
What effects pedal do you use?
Like at the moment, I love like the Terra Echo. It's a really nice one because it gets like very like spaced out. And then sometimes it's also nice, certainly when I play like melodies that are a bit like screechy, then I like to put like some extra like drives, and it sounds like a guitar. But the Terra Echo is really like my favorite.
Have you seen the Cosmos?
Yes.
By Soma. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I have it.
Oh, you have
Yes.
it. Oh.
Why does it not surprise me that you have it?
I have everything from Soma. I have everything.
Just get the Empress Sawyer. It can buy, or it can make any piece of gear, the piece of gear that you need.
Amazing.
Gear clash. Anyone else got questions? I've got more.
Front row here.
Hey, so obviously talking about your early stage in production, going from entirely in the computer to, I mean, talking about gear, like obsessed with gear and everything. And like you mentioned like materiality and like I guess being in contact with the music directly, and that seems like a super important part of your process. What do you maybe talk about? I don't know, like, what would you lose if you went back to? Could you do your process back entirely in the computer on its own without any of this gear? And what would you lose by doing so?
I think I could definitely, because at some point I like also got Ableton Push, and then like sometimes when I do more like theater productions, I cannot have like all the gear with me, I use it. But then sometimes when I miss is this, you know, maybe if I find something that I can have this like improv, because I think just like drawing drums, that too like I get too like bored quickly. So I think if I would find something that I could also just like be like off the grid, because I think like what's interested for me in even like this concept of like the machine is also that like how to make the machine feel, you know, like how to bring the machine out of its grid. Because I think like how I play it, maybe I'm kind of also trying to test like the limits of like being able to make it sound like off the grid, even if it's like on this like 4/4 or even, because that's the thing is like you can program it maybe off grid, but then it's still on a grid. So sometimes I feel like that element of like me, that's why if I would play all my patterns, just like play and have all the layers, it would just be a mess because it would just be like everything like on top of each other. So I think it's also about, yeah, so that's what I'm kind of looking for. So I feel like if there's ever going to be something that I can have this closer connection to the computer with like the same way of like approaching it, then definitely.
Do you play any instruments? Percussion? Do you like?
It's an interesting one because I've played like guitar when I was like younger, and then I like kind of tried to like be more with like this idea of like instruments, but I love electronic instruments so much. I don't know why. I have like, yeah, I think that's maybe like my geeky side where I just love technology and like everything that you can do with it. So I guess like that's how I look at like the gear. Maybe I look at it really as like instruments.
I mean, it is an instrument.
Yeah, even like the CDJs. I think it's just so wonderful because you can just, yeah, you can just do so much with it. And then when you really get into like the physics of music that I feel, and that's why I'm also so into the musical realms, is just like it's so infinite. You can just keep going and keep like finding and like researching, and there's so much that you can do. So yeah, so I feel I'm just like at the beginning of even exploring all the possibilities, or like what, you know. So then it becomes also interesting because then having the parallel with the research also brings me maybe to the gear where I'm just like, oh, I'm thinking about vibrational things, or I'm thinking about like noise and this idea of like dissonance and resonance and stuff, and then it's like, oh, there's like gear that fits perfectly to like research that. So I think a lot also like the gear that I get, and also is kind of like connected to where I'm at in like my research and like things that I want to explore.
Do you say you is it stand there? It's okay. Do you say you kind of get more out of the sort of research on the academic level than you do, say, listening to peers or other contemporary musicians? Like, would you rather read a book to get inspiration for a new song than listen to music?
That's interesting. I think it's maybe not. I think because listening to music is something that's just part of my everyday. So I feel like that's maybe like the effortlessness of just waking up, listening to things. And then when I'm like, oh, I'm doing research, or a lot of times how I manage to, otherwise I don't get myself to make new work. It's like, oh, like when I get like a commission or something, or someone's like, oh, do you have a new live set? And I'm like, oh, finally I can research something. And then it becomes like the beginning of like a whole trajectory. And then that's like the beauty also of like the YouTube spirals, or like, you know, the like book spirals, where then, but then it's interesting because then it's like going into the books, but then like going back to the music, going back to the books, so it's like a dynamic. But then it's really interesting. I think like if I think about the things that inspire me at the moment, it would be like a mixture of like 80s kind of like meditation tapes, like very weird, like synthy, like DNA music tapes, and then like free techno, like techno that's played in the woods, like Spiral Tribe, and then like, yeah, like African like club music, or like Congolese like club music. So it's like, and
Sorry,
then
I'm hugging it. I was just like, asking all the questions.
Sorry, not to interrupt the questioning, but in terms of production,
yeah,
a lot of the things that are usually said is like you're only as good as you're only as good as your last record, right? So I feel like you take a lot of departures, which is very healthy, in a sense of, am I right in thinking that you detach with the improvisation of live, that can turn into what you might end up being a product, whatever it is going forward? But do you ever feel the pressure, or do you just detach from the nervousness of holding yourself back from the last thing that you did? Because I feel like you touch your equipment or whatever instance of what you do differently. Does visual art, or not coming from music and doing visual art previously, help you just detach from whatever the connotation of how people usually think of the last record being? You need to surmount or be better or be more accomplished than what you did last before. Does that help you just kind of carry on and kind of envisaging, using research to kind of use your way forward?
Yeah, I think definitely that. I think maybe, I think, and that's something that maybe it's also how I grew up, and just like, I'm kind of always identified with kind of being an outsider. So I'm always kind of identifying with wanting to do things differently. So then it's also like how I kind of maybe also for myself understand that it's like I have my whole life to make music, so I'm just like really excited about always finding new forms. How can I stay excited? Which sometimes I tell like people who just started producing, like, don't forget that like the first few moments that you're like behind your computer and making tracks, those are actually like the most amazing, because you don't really know what you're doing, you're just like fiddling around, and then going from zero to like something that's like so beautiful, because after you kind of get like you kind of get like limited by your own ideas of what it means to have skills. And then it's like, I don't know, sometimes I think about like, obviously it's important to have some idea of like skills just for yourself to feel comfortable, but then maybe I'm always like working with this idea of like transcending it all the time, and then becoming again this like, ooh, I don't know what I'm doing. And then like, that's where I found like so much inspiration. I get excited, and then like I get bored about doing the same thing again. And then it's more about, for me personally, then it's more becomes this thing of like, and that's what sometimes is difficult, where then you're like really busy and like you're touring and you don't really have time in the studio, is like how to catch the moment just when I'm getting bored of like doing something a certain type of way. So it's like being sure that these moments are recorded. And then, but then that's what also what's been interesting, like what I've been doing now with like recording my live sets, is that like it's always possible to tap into your past self. So you can always even just like listen to the recording and be like, oh, this is nice, and then you can tap into it, and then you can really extract it too. So I think even just like always recording what you do, and even when you do live sets, you will always be able to tap into that energy because you have it, you grasped it. So then I think it's like connected to that. But then I think it's really just, I don't know, I think maybe that's kind of like my kind of like radical side, where I'm just like, I like kind of sometimes also doing things the wrong way. So I'm just like, I feel like so much power, so much more powerful by just being just like, I do it differently.
We was also talking just upstairs about how you kind of feel quite liberated that you're just releasing on your own label now, and the only person you really have to answer to is yourself.
Exactly.
And that there's a freedom to that. There's not like, when there's a label, there might be certain pressures and things that are expected of you, and when you're only answering for yourself, I guess you can do departures and you can go off in different directions, because the only person who's gonna question you is yourself.
Yeah, but also, and we spoke about it also earlier, also this idea of like, how is my connection with the audience? And that's like what I realized now, certainly after having had an audience for so long, was like, I learned so much from, the people who come to my shows, and having this connection and playing live, and like people actually connecting to the music. So then it's also about, maybe that's what's really nice with like the changes in the industry now. It's like this connection with your audience much more quicker, and people just, even if you're like not really reachable, but people can kind of reach you. You kind of like know what what people kind of are into, and like what they like, even if it's just, after your show, people like coming to tell you how they felt. But then even there, you know, when you're actually there and like you have your show and like everyone's just screaming or going crazy, and then you're just like, oh, but this is not released yet, you know. And then it's just like, you know. So then it also gives like a really nice way of like having confidence where, you know, maybe it's not the label that's dictating the release, but it's like the audience that's dictating it, because I already tested it out and I've seen, you know. But then the difficulty with that now that I'm becoming so precious. I'm like, oh, no. I'm like, you know, because I feel also so connected to this music. So that's why I'm like, yeah, I'm excited when I get to the next step of like bringing it back out.
Any more questions?
Hello.
Hey.
Hi. Thank you. This has been really inspiring. Thank you. I am interested to hear if you have any particular key works or like key kind of scholars and stuff with your like research or like recommendations. Do you know what I mean? Like. That's been super inspiring. I'm going to be thinking about that for sure. Like, I was particularly interested in when you were talking about like energies and like how I thought that was really fascinating. So, if you have any kind of elaborations there, I'd love to hear. And thanks.
Oh yeah, thank you. I guess like who I'm kind of really interested about at the moment is. This is one scholar, I think they're based in Los Angeles, like Nina Soon Eichheim. They have this book called Sensing Sound. Yes, Sensing Sound. And they come also from a position where they are themselves like a singer, and they're actually talking about this idea that like sound is vibration, and how also thinking about how our ears are actually also conditioned through like the system in what we live, so that also has like a influence on how we hear. And then this other scholar that I'm really excited about, also because they really push these ideas of sound even further than just, you know, the materiality of sound, is like Louis Chudesoke. They wrote this book about the black techno poetics. They have this amazing essay about like dub and like kind of like the technology of dub music. And yeah, black techno poetics. Yeah, Louis Chudesoke. And
We're not as French as the Congolese.
no, I think the black techno poetics, you can find it with that. The name will come out. But yeah, then he like, I think like his recent work is also like thinking a lot about how, you know, how like black people in particular has always been in the forefront of like pushing music technology somewhere else. Like there's always been like this like musician that uses the guitar differently, etc. And then also thinking about like race in connection with like technology, and then like the connection with like AI. So it's really interesting also how a lot of, and I think it's something obviously that's maybe like happening more and more like recently, where people are kind of using sonic metaphors and sonic ideas as like a way to kind of like think about like theory and like think about the world. And then the other side, and I really go into like ancient cosmology. It's really interesting, like when you start actually reading in like different like spiritual traditions, even just like how they think about how the world kind of came into being, and like this kind of like cosmic, like the beginning of the world, then it becomes really interesting, because it's always like very sonic. It's always about like vibration and like spirituality. And then yeah, even in like one of my favorite goddesses of like the Egyptian ancient times, it's like goddess Hathor, and she's like the goddess of beauty, of music, and she has this like cow ears, Yeah, so it's been like just this like really interesting way of just like diving into this more like, yeah, traditional forms of ideas that are more kind of like theoretic, but then also going into spiritual, spiritual reading of the world, but then from like all these different cultures.
It's a nice little list to get you started, I think. Is there any more questions? Front row.
Hello.
Hey.
That was amazing.
Thank you.
A bit of a noob coming into this production thing.
Yeah.
The sounds that you make are like pretty mind blowing. Like on the drum machine. Are they made in the drum machine, or are you putting those samples into it?
Some I put into it, and some are. So this one is sampler.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this one is sampler. So or the thing is like I have kind of like a soft spot of using like sound from machines itself, because I kind of feel like it's where the personality of the machine comes out. I also like use, and then it's just like about tweaking it, but I sometimes also really love using the sound of the machines, and then I add some samples in it. But then, you know, there's so much that you can tweak that sometimes, you know, even like making it shorter and stuff. So I really like this idea of like sampling in that way. And then I guess this kind of functions as like a FM synth, where it kind of like starts from somewhere, but then you can do so many things in like decay, color and stuff. So I guess this one could be said that it's like weirdly analog, like digital. And then sometimes it's also like I've had some, I don't have something like that yet, but I've had the opportunity to just like work with like a mono synth, with like something that's like literally, you know, there's like nothing, and then you just start like, and then it's like, and then you just have to build, and it's just so I feel like that's probably like the next step that I would love to go to, like really like, because it's something so beautiful of like the fragility of like catching like a sound, and you're like, oh, this is it, and then you're like, oh, okay, I can lose it like every second. So
You might not be able to ever get it back as well.
it's so scary. It's so scary. So then always press record. Never forget that. Like that's something that I've learned, because I've had like sessions, and then you're like just like twirling, you're like flying around somewhere else, and then you're like, this was amazing, and then you come down, and then you're like, oh, I didn't press record.
Yeah. Oh man.
And that's a lot of times very painful. And you have to like start like, especially when everything is so like, yeah. So that sometimes feels also like a big responsibility, because yeah, I have to be there for the music to exist, because I have to like play it. So that's also nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, just one more question, if there's one. Thanks for being a very
Yeah.
engaged
Amazing. Thank
crowd.
you.
It's great.
Hi, thanks so much, by the way. I've been to a few of these, but I've never had like a live sort of techno set during the talk before, and it was really great. I guess my question was about sort of collaboration, because I guess improvised music's like often been done with multiple people improvising together, and I guess you kind of talk about the drum machine sort of talking to each other, and I suppose using rhythm as a way to connect to the audience. But I suppose I wondered if you'd ever, had other people and sort of brought this kind of improvisational approach into a situation where there's other musicians that you're working with, and if you have, like, how you approach that, I suppose.
Yeah, to be honest, like I really love collaboration. I think just being in the studio with like other artists, it's always so inspiring. Like I've had like a few projects, and it's like really interesting. Like I had projects with me being in the studio with people, but then also kind of just virtually, where it's like definitely with one of my good friends, like Curtly, where we're just like during this pandemic, we're making this like really weird sound pieces, just like, yeah, would just be like, send me things, and then send me stuff, and then do things. So I think there's always like, yeah, I don't know. I'm always like looking, I don't know, I like this idea of always being like in awe of like where it can go, and that's like what I feel sometimes. I feel just like there's so much, and sometimes it can be overwhelming because there's so much in music, and then sometimes you're just like, wow, you're just with one person jamming, and then you're like, oh, I don't know this side of myself, and it's like, damn, it's like, so it's really nice also how, and that's like what I think with sound and music, it's like such a, it's like communication without language, right? And then maybe sometimes I feel like I'm not so good in words, and maybe it's because I'm like, I speak different languages, then you're never good in like one language. But I feel like with like music, it's like, it's a bit cheesy. It's like musical, like language, or like universal language, and like everyone can connect to it. And I guess also, and that's something that's been really nice with just playing in different places. Like I've been to places that I've never, I come from like, or like I grew up in like a small town in Belgium, Leuven, where they make Stellartois. Like I would have never thought that I would, I would have never thought I would end up in like Georgia. I went to like Bissili, and then it's just like, just how is my music connecting with people there? Like, sometimes I go, certainly when I go in other places or you go to Asia, I'm just like, how is my music connected? And then you really realize like, no, that's actually, we have so much more in common musically, maybe not in other places, but like I feel musically, so yeah. So I always think like, you can learn also a lot from just seeing someone connect with their music. So yeah, I'm definitely for the collaborations. I think it's like a good way also to push yourself somewhere else.
So I'm just going to say, you said you weren't a producer, you're an artist, so I'd say you're both. I'd also say the way you speak about music is actually very beautiful and poetic, and I think a lot of people in the crowd here would probably relate to that. It's been a very inspiring talk. So everyone give it up for Nkisi.
Thank you so much. Thank you.